Chapter 36. Received an honorary degree along with other honorees. 2 were awarded doctorates of civil law, 1, a doctorate of music, another A. in science, and 2, once being Teo, the honorary doctorate of literature. In Kenya took place in the Sheldonian, a long and rambling ceremony conducted in Latin for 6 distinguished persons, though, in Vanessa's mind, this a celebration mainly for Teo. At last, he was receiving the recognition deserved, and after the ceremony, she stood and him with pride as he mingled with his guests. She had met Teo briefly before the ceremony and they had hugged, but hardly spoken, too many people and not enough time. She thought at first that it was perhaps the way it should be, with no time for sentimentalism, but no, she decided, that was not the way it should be. They. Do you know all these people? Suleiman whispered. No. Vanessa shook her head, though she did. The only one who mattered was Teo. Come. A young woman called as she ran towards them. You must be my father's friend, Vanessa. Yes, Vanessa smiled, and you must be Kemi. I am. Kemi gripped her hand tightly before turning to Suleiman. Suleiman took Kemi's hand and Vanessa breathed a sigh of relief. Suleiman could be funny about things like this sometimes. Come, Kemi urged. Let me introduce you to everyone. Again, Vanessa hugged Teo and congratulated Hi/2. Which will I see you? He asked, releasing her from the hug, but not letting go of her hand. I'll see you soon. Vanessa squeezed his fingers, which were being taken by others as more well-wishers surrounded them, jostling and making it hard to stand still. She moved away, following Kemi, to be introduced to Bisi and Bolaji, and reintroduced to Uncle Kaode. Vanessa did not recognize Uncle Kaode at first. And, despite his enthusiastic greeting, he seemed unable to remember her either. Which saddened her until she realized that he had had too much to drink and others were busy trying to find a place for him to sit down. Then Kemi introduced Vanessa to Miriam, and Vanessa was stunned at how youthful Miriam looked. She had always imagined Leo's wife as being someone of her age, and perhaps she was, but SHC looked younger. She was friendly, too, and instead of feeling jealous, Vanessa felt strangely sorry for Miriam and for Teo. They spoke for a while about what each other did and then about their children, who stood not far away engaged in a conversation of their own. So what's America like then? Suleiman asked Kemi. Great. The weather's good, the music's great. It's totally happening. But I hear they don't care much for Muslims over there, especially after should come. Not in the Bay Area. You can be any religion you want in San Francisco, it doesn't matter. You should come. Come and stay with me. Serious? Of course. Vanessa smiled, wishing she could hear more, but Bolai, whom she only vaguely remembered, was keen to talk as their group started walking towards Belial, where a reception was being held in Teo's honor. Miriam announced that she was leaving early and Vanessa felt she must do the same. Oh, but you can't go. Teo insisted. No, you can't. Kemi insisted. Dad's been dying to see you. Vanessa's heart leapt as she heard these words, and she was touched by Kemi's kindness. I'd love to stay, but I must get back to London for Edward. Don't worry about Dad, Suleiman interrupted. I'm going back. Dad will be fine. And so she went with Teo and talked to more of his friends, still wishing there had been time for just the 2 of them. Perhaps they would meet up in London before he returned to America. And then, as she was lost in her own thoughts, he walked towards her and took her arm. "Come," he said. "If we don't escape now, we never will." "So now it's Professor Ajay, Doctor in Literacy," she said, smiling as they walked together, past Christ Church, towards the river. "Ego octorate meu etosius university submitted gradum doctoris. In litteris honoris causa," he replied. "So you haven't forgotten your Latin?" "Oh yes, I have," he laughed. "Truthfully, that's the only line I can remember. And I'm not sure I could give you a good translation." She listened to the familiar tenor of his voice and thought that it hardly mattered what he said. Of course they would both make conversation because that was what one did, but just to be with him, and alone with him, was wonderful. She was due back in London before dark, and Theo, she knew, could not abandon his own reception for long, but for a short while they were on their own together. She watched him, as he looked across Christchurch meadows where cows basked lazily in the late afternoon sun. Just before they left the reception, Theo had retrieved a small parcel from the porter's lodge, which he now carried in one hand. He had stopped for a moment, turning back to gaze at the college. And she thought he looked more casual and relaxed than the last time they had met. He had changed out of subfusc, and was now wearing pale khaki trousers and a light blue shirt. After all these years, he was still handsome, unknowingly so. She wore the blue cotton dress that Suleiman had chosen, a pair of cream suede shoes, a last-minute extravagance, and a straw hat. "What are you thinking?" she asked quietly. "Sorry?" "You seem deep in thought. What are you thinking?" she said, louder this time so he could hear. "The history of this place, Vanessa. There is so much history here. Did one RN the Master's Lodge, there's a guest book that starts in 1909. In America. Something like that would be treated as ancient, wouldn't it? But here it's just ordinary guest book, and one that I'm supposed to sign alongside all these famous people. There are prime ministers, world leaders, and all sorts. 1. The names of Harold Wilson, Isaiah Berlin, Gandhi, and even Sand. The Karmas. Now that's interesting," Vanessa remarked, remembering their story. Was just saying how interesting, the Karmas, Wilson, Gandhi, and now you. He laughed, and then they walked for some moments in silence, each with their own thoughts. She wanted to ask him about Kearney, and about his plans for the future. They had not yet spoken about his accident, or the months of depression in San Francisco, something his daughter had mentioned to her in confidence. She wanted to tell him about father's book and her plans to return. Oxford really hasn't changed, has it? Look at Christchurch, and this. Theo pointed to the meadows. If I close my eyes, it could still be 1964. There. Sounds are the same. The bells, the coaches shouting to their rowers on the river. Light aircraft in the sky and the sounds of trains in the distance. There is even the same smell of grass and river. He paused with his eyes still shut. And then, when I look again, here you are. It's like a beautiful dream come true. Well, I've certainly changed in the space of 30 or so years. Ah, but you are still the gracious, generous soul that I knew, and the beautiful woman I fell in love with, he said, walking more slowly. She smiled sadly. They had reached the river and walked along the path that ran in front of the college boathouses. Do you remember summer 8s? She laughed, knowing what he would. When you and Geeta got completely drunk and wanted to get into the boat, say next? With the rowers from St. John's? Are you sure it wasn't the Balliol rowers? She laughed. Shall we? Theo pointed to a bench by the river bank. But shouldn't you be getting back? This is where I want to be, and I must also. Thank you, because one know you had a hand in my receiving this award. Not at all, she said, even though it was true that she had written something to support his nomination, but her voice alone would not have been enough to have him selected. She sat down, pleased for the rest from her new shoes. Kemp's a delightful young woman, Theo. One wish that Suleiman had been able. So that we could make our children? Theo smiled. To stay a little longer. Gob Theo. But it sound like Kemi is already spoken. Not until I say so, he laughed. And how is Suleiman? Well, very well, she smiled, remembering the way her son had teased her as she struggled that morning over what to wear. She had gone into his room to model her clothes, and at first he said nothing, too busy listening to his Chill, Mum, chill, he said, when finally he had noticed her. You look terrific. You'll look beautiful for him. So you haven't told me much about your stay in America, she remarked. What is this book you're thinking of writing? She listened as he told her about his writings on American racial politics. His perspective as an African in America sounded interesting, but, as hard as she listened, it was only him she thought about as he talked, who he had been and who he still was. Perhaps you should have written about your time in England as a student. And the racism here, and I suppose my father. She let the words trail off. It wasn't just your father, Nessa. I was proud, too proud in those days, and so stupid, too. He paused. Oh, Vanessa. Theo, she said, speaking before he had time to say any more, and then, not wanting to dwell on regrets, she asked him to tell her more about San Francisco. What's the other project you mentioned, and what about retirement? He paused for a long while before answering, perhaps, like her, sifting through thoughts, trying to determine when and what to say. What was worth saying? So I take it you won't be retiring when you return to Nigeria? She added. Elle ought to retire because the age of retirement in Nigerian universities is 60. But I'll continue to teach, if not officially, then unofficially. Oh, but surely now you have this honorary degree they'll dispense with the official rules and make you vice-chancellor for life? I'll hope not, he exclaimed, turning to face her. I just want to go back key. Ately. I don't want to be involved in university politics anymore. I've done my time, I'm too old now. He placed one hand along the back of the bench and there other in the space between them. Will you come and visit me one day? I'd love to. And in fact. And of course, you must bring Edward, he said, before she could finish. She smiled. It was thoughtful of him, but Edward found it hard to travel these days. Even the short journey from London to Oxford, which he had wanted Ed to make today, proved at the last minute to be too much for him. I know. Theo nodded. You've told me that it's difficult for him to travel. But I pray that he regains his strength. I shall pray for a miracle. Thank you, she replied. Does this mean you believe in prayer now? In my own way, he mused. She nodded and gazed at the river, watching the rowers. And how I prayed? That you would return, that we would find a way to make things work, she thought. She looked back at Theo. He was watching her, so she turned away. Oh, look at that! She exclaimed, spotting a squirrel close to their feet. Its tail was arched and nose lifted, sniffing the air. Do you remember what you used to call them? The squirrel scuttled a few feet away, rising now on his hind legs with paws up, waiting. What? Teo asked, looking bemused. One remember you calling them rats with bushy tails. He laughed. They were good times together, weren't they? He removed his band from the back of the bench and rested it with the other on his lap. Yes, and miss those days, he said softly, filling in for her silence. Sometimes I wish I could just go back in time and relive them. I would. Oak different ch. Oh, one sees now. And what would you change? I would have married you. Oh Teo, she exclaimed. No, it's true. As an old man, I realize what I've missed. He sighed, giving her knee a friendly tap. She took his hand and squeezed it as if there was nothing more to say, yet every nerve in her body itched to speak. I have some things for you. He picked up the parcel from the bench and gave it to her. A letter lay on top of a book. She read the letter first. I am writing to inform you that I have serious intentions with Vanessa. I wrote it a long time ago, Teo said, interrupting her reading. It's Victor. To my uncle and ... Well, I just wanted you to know that I was serious and that I had wanted to marry you. Tears came to her eyes as she read more. And this? She asked, brushing away the tears. And for goodness. How did you get this? She flipped quickly through the pages of her old diary and saw the places where she had scribbled Oluwakeod, the name she had dreamed of giving their child. My God, she mumbled, and then, as she struggled to hold back more tears, a middle-aged couple approached them and asked if they would take a photograph for them. Certainly, Teo offered, standing up to take the camera from the strangers, who now stood in front of them. The man held his lady by the waist, sucked in his stomach and smiled as his wife leant her braided head against his chest. Vanessa watched them as they posed, and, as she watched, she felt a wave of déjà vu. Her mind raced across time to find the answer. Was it a memory of her photographer friend, Seda Keita? Was it the way he asked his subjects to pose? Or was it Sulamad in 1970, with her hair braided like this woman's? Or perhaps she was seeing an image of her parents before she was born, in a time that she had only imagined? Sticks and sandals, she thought. Mum and Danjuma. Teo and Vanessa. Now let's get one of you two, the man offered. Okay, Teo agreed, cheerfully handing back the camera. He sat down and moved closer to Vanessa, until their hips touched and she prayed for the tears. Oh, come on, my brother, the man urged, lowering his camera. Let's see to stay put. Vanessa clenched her jaw in an even greater effort to hold back her tears. Little more loving. And smile for the camera. Teo laughed and slid his arm around her shoulders. Instinctively, she turned her head to his and, without thinking, tired of thinking, she kissed him gently on the lips, and then it was fervently, not caring what their other couple thought or said as the tears ran down her cheeks. Night had fallen and 3 students who had passed them on their way out to the river now passed them again, still sitting on the bench, hand in hand, with her head on his shoulder, staring across the river. They must be mad, said one. It's freezing. Probably tourists, whispered another. And then the ringing of Christchurch's bells drowned their voices out. There. Cows in the meadows paid no attention to these hourly chimes. The moon, however, took notice of the bells and rose from behind its clouds to light up the sky and send silver ripples across the Isis.